Imagine a country with no income tax, no tax on your wages, no tax on your salary. You work, you earn money, you keep all of it. Sounds impossible, doesn't it? Sounds like a fantasy. But Britain actually experienced this. For decades, Britain had no income tax. The government still functioned. Roads were built, armies were maintained, governments operated. But how? How did the government make money without taxing income? Today, we're living in a world where income tax seems inevitable, seems like the only way governments can function. We assume that without income tax, society would collapse. That government couldn't operate. But Britain proves that's not entirely true. Britain maintained a powerful government, a vast empire, and an advanced society without income tax for most of its history. Today, we're going to explore 15 ways that Britain made money without income tax. 15 alternative revenue sources that funded a nation. If you're interested in economic history, how governments function, how taxation systems evolved, and the fascinating history of Britain, subscribe to Surprising. Every week we explore historical mysteries and economic puzzles. We ask the questions that make you think. We discover how societies actually worked in the past. Subscribe now so you don't miss our next video on economic and social history. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. And thanks for watching. This is the story of how a nation funded itself without income tax. A story that would shock most modern taxpayers. Reason 15: Customs and excise duties. Taxing what people import and consume. Britain's primary source of revenue for centuries was customs duties, taxes on imported goods. When goods entered Britain from abroad, they were taxed. At every port, at every customs house, ships arrived in British ports, merchants unloaded cargo, customs officials inspected the goods, a percentage was paid to the crown, a tax on imported goods, a tax on international trade. These duties generated enormous revenue, far more than most people realize. Britain was a trading nation, an island nation, a maritime nation. Ships constantly arrived with goods from around the world, spices from India, sugar from the Caribbean, cloth from Europe, wine from France, timber from the Baltic, silks from the East, cotton from the colonies, tobacco from America. All of these goods were taxed when they entered Britain. A merchant importing spices would pay a percentage in customs duty. A merchant importing wine would pay a percentage in customs duty. These duties added up, accumulated, became the primary funding mechanism for government. Excise duties were also charged on goods produced domestically. Beer was taxed when it was brewed. Spirits were taxed when they were distilled. Tobacco was taxed when it was sold. Salt was taxed when it was produced. These excise duties were unpopular with merchants, unpopular with producers. But they generated revenue that allowed the government to function, that allowed the military to operate, that allowed roads to be built and maintained. Reason 14: Tariffs and trade protection. Protecting British industry through taxation. Britain used tariffs strategically to protect domestic industry. To protect British manufacturers, foreign goods were taxed heavily, substantially, so much that they became expensive. British-produced goods were taxed lightly, or not at all. This discouraged people from buying foreign goods, made them expensive, made them unaffordable, encouraged them to buy British instead, encouraged them to support British manufacturers. British manufacturers benefited enormously, got protected markets, got guaranteed customers. British workers had jobs, had employment, had income. The government benefited from the tariff revenue, got revenue from taxing imports. It was a triple win for the British government and British industry. But foreign nations resented it. Foreign merchants complained bitterly. They couldn't access British markets, couldn't sell their goods without paying huge tariffs. Britain's naval power meant Britain could enforce these tariffs, could control trade, could prevent foreign merchants from smuggling goods, could maintain the tariff system. This naval power was crucial. It allowed Britain to maintain trade barriers and reap the revenue benefits. Reason 13: Stamp duties and paper taxes. Taxing transactions and documents. Britain taxed documents heavily, extensively. Almost every significant document. Want to buy property? You need stamps on the deed, legal stamps, official stamps. Pay a tax for the privilege. Pay for the official stamp that makes it legal. Want to create a legal contract? Stamps required. Official stamps. Pay a tax. Want to publish a newspaper? Tax required. Stamp tax. Document tax. Want to sell goods? Bills required. Stamps required. Tax required. Wills required stamps. Bills of sale required stamps. Marriage licenses required stamps. Every significant transaction generated revenue through stamp duties. This was particularly controversial. The colonists in America hated the Stamp Act so much they revolted. They rebelled. They fought a war, all over stamp duties. But in Britain itself, stamp duties were accepted, expected, normal, part of doing business, part of conducting transactions. They generated significant revenue for centuries. Centuries of revenue from stamp duties. Reason 12. Land taxes and property taxes. Taxing the most valuable asset, land, was taxed. Extensively, property owners paid taxes on their land. This was based on the value of the land, on the rental income it could generate. You owned land, you paid a tax, an annual tax, a perpetual tax. Wealthy landowners paid the most, had the most valuable land, paid the most taxes. Peasants who owned small plots paid less, had less valuable land, paid smaller taxes. This was relatively fair. Those with the most valuable assets paid the most. Land taxes generated steady revenue for the government. Year after year, century after century, regular, predictable, reliable. Land couldn't be hidden, couldn't be moved, couldn't be concealed from tax collectors. Tax collectors could walk the land, see who owned it, assess its value, collect the tax. This made land tax efficient, easy to collect, difficult to evade. Reason 11. Monopolies and royal grants. Government control of valuable commodities. The British government granted monopolies on valuable goods. Exclusive trading rights. The East India Company had a monopoly on trade with India and the East Indies. They had exclusive rights. Nobody else could trade there. Nobody else could access those markets. The Crown granted these exclusive trading rights. In exchange, the company paid fees. Substantial fees, ongoing fees, royalty payments. The company made enormous profits from their monopoly. Huge profits, extraordinary profits. The Crown received a percentage, a cut of the profits. Salt was monopolized. Tobacco was monopolized. Various other commodities were monopolized. These monopolies generated revenue through licensing fees and profit sharing. It was inefficient economically, reduced competition, reduced innovation, but it was profitable for the government, generated significant revenue. The government essentially shared in the profits of monopoly businesses. Reason 10. Crown lands and royal estates. The government as landowner and businessman. The Crown owned enormous amounts of land, vast amounts, truly enormous quantities, forests, farms, properties, hunting grounds, estates. The Crown was the largest landowner in the country. By far, these lands generated revenue through rental and through sale of resources. Timber from royal forests was sold, cut down, sold to merchants, generated revenue. Agricultural products from Crown lands were sold. Grain, wool, livestock, generated revenue. Tenants on Crown lands paid rent. Annual rent, perpetual rent, generated revenue. The Crown was essentially a business, operating businesses, running enterprises, collecting revenue like any business would. This was common in medieval and early modern Europe. Rulers were landlords and merchants. They owned property. They operated businesses. They generated profit. The Crown was just doing what rulers did, operating as a business. Reason 9. Licensing and fees. Charging for permission to do business. Want to operate a brewery? Pay a license fee. An annual fee. Perpetual fees. Want to operate a tavern? Pay a license fee. A tavern license. Pay up. Want to operate a market stall? Pay a license fee. A market license. Pay to do business. Want to practice law? Pay a fee. A licensing fee. Pay to practice your profession. Want to practice medicine? Pay a fee. A medical license fee. Pay to heal people. Every profession required licensing. Every license generated revenue. Merchants needed licenses. Traders needed licenses. Craftsmen needed licenses. Blacksmiths needed licenses. Bakers needed licenses. Butchers needed licenses. The government charged for these permissions, generated steady revenue. Thousands of licenses, thousands of fees, steady revenue stream. Reason 8. Fines and legal penalties. Punishment as revenue. When people broke laws, They paid fines, court fines, legal penalties. The government kept the fines, used them for revenue, used them to fund operations. Fines for poaching, fines for trespassing on royal land, fines for violating trade regulations, fines for theft, fines for assault, fines for various offenses, fines for breaking guild regulations, fines for unfair trade practices. The larger the fine, the more revenue generated. This created an incentive to enforce laws, to catch lawbreakers, to prosecute them. But it also created a problematic incentive, an incentive to impose large fines to generate revenue. Justice could become corrupted by the desire for revenue, but it worked as a revenue source, generated significant income. Reason 7: Church taxes and tithes. Religious contributions to the crown. The church paid taxes to the crown, contributed revenues, funded the government. Bishops and abbots paid fees, substantial fees, annual fees. Monasteries paid taxes. Religious institutions paid taxes. The crown also collected tithes on behalf of the church, kept a percentage. A tithe was traditionally 1/10 of agricultural produce or income. Farmers paid tithes to support the church, paid 1/10 of their harvest. The crown collected these tithes, kept a share, a percentage. This was a significant revenue source. Substantial income. Every farm in the country paid tithes. That's a lot of money, accumulating year after year. Reason 6: Feudal dues and military obligations. Extracting value from the feudal system. The feudal system generated revenue for the crown, extensive revenue. When a noble's son inherited land, the crown charged a fee, an inheritance tax of sorts, a wardship fee, a relief, a payment to the crown. When a noble wanted to marry off his daughter, the crown charged a fee. Marriage license, marriage fee, pay to marry. When a noble was called to military service, he could pay to avoid it. Instead of fighting, pay money. The crown kept the payment. When a noble needed permission for various things, the crown charged fees. Permission to hunt on crown lands, permission to use crown forests, permission for various activities. All charged fees. The feudal system was a complex network of obligations and payments. The crown extracted value from every level, every interaction, every transaction. Reason 5: Wool taxes and export duties. The medieval gold mine wool was England's most valuable export for centuries. The most important commodity. English wool was prized throughout Europe. Medieval Europe needed wool for cloth. Wool was essential, necessary, valuable beyond measure. When wool left England, it was taxed. Export duties were collected. Wool merchants had to pay to export their goods, had to pay a percentage. These duties generated enormous revenue, truly enormous. Staggering amounts. Wool was incredibly valuable, so the tax was incredibly profitable. For centuries, wool taxes were Britain's primary revenue source, the main funding mechanism. Reason 4: Loans and bonds. Borrowing against future revenue. Governments can borrow money. Issue bonds. Promise future repayment. Britain issued government bonds, governmental debt instruments. Wealthy individuals bought these bonds, invested in government debt. The government got immediate revenue, got cash right now. Bondholders got interest payments, got returns on their investment. This was common when the crown needed immediate funds, for wars or emergencies. Couldn't wait for customs duties to accumulate, needed money right now. So they borrowed, issued bonds, took on debt. The debt accumulated, grew over time, became a burden, but for the short term, it generated revenue. Immediate revenue, cash when needed. Reason 3: Banking and minting coins. Controlling currency as a revenue source. The crown controlled the minting of coins, created money, literally created currency. Creating coins was profitable. The crown could mint coins and spend them. The metal cost less than the coin's face value. The difference was profit. A coin made from copper might have a face value of 1 penny. The copper cost half a penny. The difference was profit. This was called seigneurage, the crown's profit from minting coins. It was a hidden tax. Inflation generated by the crown's desire for revenue. People didn't understand they were being taxed. The purchasing power of their money decreased, but it was still taxation, still extracting wealth from the people. But it worked as a revenue source, generated profit, accumulated wealth. Reason 2. Grants and subsidies from Parliament. The nobles funding the crown. Parliament granted money to the crown, voted to fund the government. This was voluntary in theory. The crown asked, Parliament voted. The crown presented its needs. Parliament decided whether to fund them. If Parliament was unhappy with the crown, they could deny funding. They could refuse to grant subsidies, could starve the crown of money. This gave Parliament leverage, gave them power over the crown. Throughout English history, this tension between the crown and Parliament over funding was crucial. It defined the power dynamics, determined political relationships. Parliament would grant subsidies. In exchange, they gained power and influence, demanded rights, demanded concessions, demanded representation. This is how Parliament gained power, through controlling the purse strings. Reason 1. Piracy and privateering. Sanction theft as government revenue. This is the most surprising revenue source, the most unusual. Britain sanctioned privateers, gave them letters of marque, official permission to raid enemy ships. Privateers were essentially licensed pirates. Official pirates, sanctioned by the crown. Privateers would attack foreign merchant ships, steal cargo, keep a percentage. The crown would take a percentage of the plunder, a percentage of the theft. It was essentially sanctioned piracy. Theft with royal approval generated enormous revenue, particularly during wars. During conflicts with other nations, the most famous privateer was Sir Francis Drake. He raided Spanish ships, made England wealthy, captured Spanish treasure, stole Spanish gold, generated enormous wealth. The crown benefited. England benefited. The privateers benefited. It was mutually profitable. Everyone got rich from piracy.